Hi, I'm Karen MacNeil. Welcome to WineSpeed.com's People to Know, insider interviews with the most fascinating and important people in the wine business. And today we're here with a person who I've admired for very long and have loved his wines. We're here with Stephen Henschke of Henschke Wines. He's the owner and winemaker. Henschke Wines is, of course, in the Barossa Valley of Australia. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Karen.
Yes, and you come from a very deeply rooted winemaking family, of course. You're the fifth generation. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about your family and their importance in the Australian industry.
Yeah, it's quite interesting when you look back and you start to research back in the history, which is what we've just recently done. We wrote a book last year, or over the last couple of years, for our 150th anniversary. And I guess being the fifth generation now, I'm the curator of the memories. So it was really important to get that down. It's quite interesting that my great-great-grandfather, that connection is really close. I knew my grandfather, and my grandfather knew his grandfather, and he was the one who came to South Australia. And he was one of the pioneers of South Australia. So he arrived soon after Adelaide was founded and settled initially at Clemzig, which is a little village that was formed in Adelaide, and then moved up and became one of the founding fathers of Lobethal, which is a village up in the Adelaide Hills. Lobethal means Valley of Praise, and settled there initially. He had lost his wife and two children on the journey out to Australia.
Oh my goodness.
So he went through a very tragic experience. They came to Australia for religious freedom, and it's painful to think about what he must have gone through. And it was diseases on the ship and what have you. And then he fortunately married again in Harndorf to a young lady from a nearby village. She was from Harndorf, he was from Lobethal. And they had another 8 children.
Another 8?
Yeah, no television in those days, we say.
My goodness.
And then from then, he, I guess as a family was growing, he moved to the Barossa. He settled at Krondorf because his younger brother, who was also married and had come across with his wife and children, settled in the same village. And so they lived in the village, raised the children, and as the children became older, he then, which is a very traditional Barossan way, that's sort of the Silesian historical sort of process, they helped to settle their children onto properties and into businesses or whatever.
Yes.
And he bought land then for his sons, including my great-grandfather, Paul Gotthard. And they moved up, in fact, even he did, moved up to Cainton, where we are now at the winery, and helped establish the vineyards and the winery. So those buildings go back to the late 50s, early 1860s.
My goodness.
And it's really quite interesting to think, all that pioneering and the varieties that they chose are very consistent with what we're doing today.
Yeah. Do you remember the first glass of wine you ever had, and who gave it to you?
I don't really, other than I have memories of having wine served at the table, the dinner table. And the dinner table was shared with my parents and my grandparents. And I guess, it was probably a normal thing in those days, but we often had our wine diluted. So it wasn't straight wine, and it was table wine that we're drinking. So it was quite interesting that even though through that era, when I was a little boy in the 50s, fortified wines was very much a thing in Australia. We drank table wine at home, and it was really a part, I think, of our cultural heritage.
Yes.
The cultural foods that came to South Australia with the Germanic people who settled there. and obviously the wines. But we were a farm, and so wine was a part of that farm.
Yes.
Everything in those days was fermented. It was a part of the preservation. Sauerkraut and Sauergurken and the Handkäse, the Kuchens, the Mettwurst, the beer, the wine. Everything was fermented as a part of their lifestyle, and really to preserve food through the winter time.
Yes.
And that's actually been maintained over the generations, which is quite interesting, even though we don't need that sort of preservation, because we don't have bitter winters like they would have had. It's still a part of our culture, if you like, our food culture.
Yes, I was so surprised years ago to go. I was in the Barossa and I went to the farmers market, and the farmers market still maintains a lot of, as you say, the early Germanic thinking about food preservation, and that leads me to ask you, thinking about Germany. You and your wife Prue, who is your partner, and she's quite renowned herself in her own right as a viticulturalist. But the two of you went to Geisenheim in Germany, which you didn't go to UC Davis, you didn't go to the University of Bordeaux. Geisenheim is, of course, a famous university. But I'm wondering if there was what sort of influence you feel that it left on your winemaking?
I really went there because of the connection between my father and Helmut Becker in those days, and that was because my father was awarded a Churchill Fellowship. It's something that most other countries don't know about, but it was really to help people who haven't had a tertiary education to learn more about their profession. And so he travelled quite widely back in the early 70s, met some luminaries like Professor Helmut Becker, Professor Bruno Goetz in Freiburg. And Becker, the coincidence was that Becker was invited to come out by Alan Antcliffe, who was the head of CSIRO in Adelaide, and really to develop Australian grape varieties. Tarango is one that is still made by Brown Brothers, and that was one of the results of that experiment. Becker, having got to know my father, Becker had a wonderful sense of humour. He's a very cheeky character, and very un-German. He would often come to visit my father because he loved my father's wine, of course, red wine. And one night I was home from university, and Becker was there, and I met him, and we were talking, and he asked me what I was going to do. And at university I studied more sort of pure sciences rather than, but it was biochemistry and botany, but in that direction, towards viticulture and winemaking. And thinking I would probably study at Roseworthy, and he said, no. He said, come and study with me in Germany. So with a little financial assistance from my father, of course, Prue and I got married because we got to know each other from university and became very close friends. So we decided to get married and go to Germany, and we lived over there for a couple of years studying at Geisenheim. And getting back to your question, that experience for us was unbelievable because we had a total paradigm shift in terms of our thinking. And so we travelled quite a bit through Europe, to France, to Austria, to Hungary, all sorts of places, and learnt a lot about the different wine growing techniques in different countries. Geisenheim was actually wasn't narrow in its thinking. It was actually quite broad in its thinking, but it was very disciplined. It's a German winemaking, and there were some things that I think were really important. Just the basics in beverage technology were really important in our thinking, and also I think for us was treasuring the fact that we had Riesling, and that we could make a style of Riesling that was different to Germany because it was dictated by our climate.
Yes.
And it was a fantastic food wine. So my dream was to refine that Riesling that my father was making to get the purity that I had seen in German Rieslings, but also then to work on our Shiraz, because in those days Shiraz was our major variety, and just to bring my ideas into working with the Shiraz and seeing whether I could improve what my father was doing, knowing that I probably couldn't, because he was making awesome wine in those days from those single vineyards, Hill of Grace and Mount Edelstone. And so it was, as I said, a real paradigm shift in thinking. I think both Prue and I learnt that, but we had, our minds were exploding of things that we wanted to trial, we wanted to do, and we wanted to really find a cool climate site to plant a little bit of Germany in the Adelaide Hills, which is what we did, and all those sorts of things. Yeah, so it was very important for us, a very important grounding for us, but it also made us recognise that being the fifth generation, there were things that our generation had the responsibility to do that couldn't be left for the next generation.
Right.
We had to make decisions, and we had to do things for the winery business, for the vineyards, and we had the education to be able to carry it out.
Yeah. Now, speaking of your Hill of Grace, which I think is probably considered your most famous wine, tell us where that name comes from, and for someone who hasn't had it, a bit about the character of that wine.
Yeah, it's ironical that Hill of Grace came about because of the success of Mount Edelstone.
Oh,
so
did it?
Mount Edelstone was my father's first single vineyard wine, and that was made in 1952.
Amazing.
And with the success of that wine, then he recognised that he had this motley old vineyard, as we sort of jokingly call it, over at the church, which was a family church, a family vineyard over generations. And he decided to make a single vineyard wine from that in 1958, and that became the first Hill of Grace.
And those must have been among the very first single vineyard wines in all of Australia.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, the Mount Edelstone now we've made over 65 vintages of, and as far as we know, it's the oldest single vineyard wine in Australia that has been consistently made for over 60 plus years.
Fantastic, really fantastic.
So it really tells the history of Australia, and if you line up 50 or 60 of those vintages, it's just amazing what you see on that line. Sure, the vintages vary, but it maintains that consistency of flavour, of the sense of place from that vineyard.
Yeah. Now, what would you say, I mean, you and Prue have been so successful, and you've really carried those two vineyards forward in such an extraordinary way. Is there a character trait you think you possess that has most led to your success?
That we personally possess? Probably we're both scientists, so we're both always questioning and always trialing and looking for answers to things, looking for improving, whether it be the vineyard environment, looking to find, I guess, an authentic way of doing everything and a natural way of doing everything. And so, that move away from chemicals and trying to do everything naturally, bringing the environment into the vineyard, the natural native plants, is all a part of a process which is making it better for the next generation than perhaps we inherited it, and improving what we do.
Thank you, Stephen. Beautifully said. And our complete interview with Stephen Henschke is on winespeed.com's People to Know page. You'll really enjoy it.